Hi, it's been a couple weeks. I don't know if you've seen the news lately, but we had something bad kind of happen here in Indianapolis, and that happened like 8 miles from my house. So, while I felt like experiencing some escapism, I didn't feel like sitting in front of a camera and talking about it all that much. So, I've gotten substantially behind in talking about what I've been watching, so we're going to try to do this all in one foul swoop. So here's a lot of movies that I've seen in the last 3 weeks. I'm not going to talk about them for very long because some of them I don't have a lot to say about. So here we go. I apologize in advance for my cheat sheet. The Favorite stars Olivia Colman in an Oscar-winning role, well-deserved from her. All three main leads of this movie are great. It's the story of Queen Anne and the two women who are vying for her affection. One of them is played by Rachel Weisz. The other one is played by Emma Stone. All three performances are great. Directed by the guy who directed Killing of a Sacred Deer and The Lobster. He has a very Kubrickian, if you will, shooting style, which I appreciate and like. It works really well here. And if you're a fan of production design, this movie's astounding. They did a really nice job creating an environment in this film. The problem is I'm gonna have to keep unlocking this thing. Then I watched the movie that won Best Picture the same year The Favorite was nominated, Green Book. And I know it's pretty fashionable these days to hate on Green Book, but my only thought about this movie is, really, Academy? This thing? I mean, it has one compelling lead performance, but Viggo Mortensen's performance I found to be overly hammy and very cartoonish at times. The movie was fine, but really, Academy? This thing? Irresistible is a movie that I honestly forgot I had seen. Jon Stewart wrote and directed this film, and Jon Stewart's time during The Daily Show was at its best, in my opinion, when it was commenting with a certain amount of righteous indignation with an accentuation of poignancy at the end. That was when the show was at its best. This movie is just angry. It's very cynical. It's very down on a political system that Jon Stewart is angered by. And that doesn't really make for good comedy. It just ends up being a forgettable film. Then I went to the theater and saw a movie. Weird, huh? We rented out a theater and saw Back to the Future, the Robert Zemeckis classic. And this movie has aged not so well. It has some very problematic aspects to it, but it is a classic. It's one of those movies that just entered the zeitgeist almost immediately and spawned a sequel, which I also watched, but at home. And Back to the Future 2, I don't think ages as well. What they did with this film was impressive in that they had to have one heck of a shot list, because not only did they replace actors, but they used scenes from the original film and cut them together with new scenes to create new scenes. So that's impressive, but I know that people tend to remember the first like 20 minutes of the movie and probably the last half hour of the movie. Everything else is not something that seems classic. It's not one of those, it doesn't contain those movie moments that really are memorable. And before you ask, no, I did not watch Back to the Future 3, because Back to the Future 3 is hot garbage. Long Shot is a funny movie starring Seth Rogen, who plays himself, let's just face it, that's all he plays these days. But he is a writer that's been brought in to help the Secretary of State, played by Charlize Theron, who is running for president, who also happens to be a crush of his from when he was a teenager. She was his babysitter. Pretty compelling romantic comedy, very funny. I found myself laughing a lot. It is very R-rated. It goes into Farrelly Brothers territory quite often, and doesn't quite take the routes that you think a movie of this nature would take. These type of movies usually have a cadence to them and a certain amount of plot points that it has to hit along the way. And it doesn't necessarily do that, or it does it in a way that is fresh. This is a movie that was pretty critically lauded, but no one actually saw it in the theater. It didn't really make a huge splash. So I was entertained by it. I thought 5 Feet Apart treated its subject matter, kids with cystic fibrosis, with a certain amount of respect, but I wish it was part of a narrative that wasn't so cliched and didn't hit those plot marks that we expect from something like this. The New Mutants is an absolute mess. The last movie that I saw that didn't have a second act was Venom, and this movie's not much better. I don't know tonally what they were going for. It just doesn't work at all. There is a reason Fox shelved this movie and Disney buried it. Also a mess was Holmes and Watson, a movie that I would probably do a DTMS on if I ever wanted to see it again. It's probably the worst big budget, big studio comedy I've ever seen, but I never want to see this thing again. Mortal Kombat is also a relative mess. The first 10 minutes of this movie are actually really good, and I wish that set the tone for the rest of the film. But after the first 10 minutes, this movie changes. And given the amount of silliness that comes with this subject matter, this movie is just insanely serious. Its biggest downfall is that it takes itself way too seriously, and the subject matter it's trying to portray is way too silly for that. There is a good property to be made here. If anything, the first 10 minutes of this film proves that, but outside of that, this movie is dull and boring and bad. Call Me By Your Name is what people think of when they think of a prestige slice-of-life drama. It's about a young man who discovers his sexuality after meeting an older man who has come to live with his family over the summer. And it is just a slice-of-life film, a well-acted, a well-written, a beautifully shot slice-of-life film. It's good, it's really good, I enjoyed it, but again, this is a prestige film. It's only going to hit certain people. A lot of people are going to be bored by this because it is just a slice of life. Speaking of movies that people will be bored by, Dragged Across Concrete stars Vince Vaughn and Mel Gibson in a movie directed by Craig Saylor, who makes movies that almost exclusively are designed to make you feel bad, and this movie is no exception. This movie is more like Bone Tomahawk than it is Brawl in Cell Block 99. In that it takes its time getting where it's going. You spend a lot of time with these characters. There's a stakeout scene that takes a considerable amount of screen time as they follow who they're following. I guess I should say it's a story of two cops who are deprived of their badges after they do something bad, but they get into a little bit of a crime situation, I guess you could say. But it does take its time. It is very slow developing. If you do a Google search for this movie and look at the key terms are boring, dull, slow. It is that. But when it hits its crescendo, it's very, very good. The final set piece is very well orchestrated, and the payoff is there for these characters. I did enjoy it, although I know that the hard R rating might not be for certain people. This is a gritty crime drama. It's a movie I enjoyed, although I probably never need to see it again. Escape Room is another movie which, if you're into production design, they knocked it out of the park with this thing. It looks great. They shot the living crap out of it. Like, cinematography and set design are top notch in this movie. The characters are pretty cliched. The story is much like just an extended jigsaw sequence. But what kills the movie for me is that, again, it sets up a cinematic universe that's probably never gonna happen. I wish they would just make a movie. Make it an entertaining movie. You don't have to make a movie that teases another movie. Make this movie good and then make a sequel. We're getting there. A Star is Born, also nominated for Best Picture in 2018. Fantastic. The movie is great. I enjoyed the film quite a bit. It's not a surprising film in any way. It kind of hits its marks along the way. But I did enjoy, this is a movie that you enjoy the performances. Lady Gaga, the songs she sings throughout the film's running time, especially in the first act and the third act, are just heartstring pullers. They're just beautiful pieces of music, and she kills it. But yeah, really well made, well done. Another kind of slice of life, but more plot-driven type of movie. The Warriors is a 1979 film about a group of gangs who meet up in New York City, and one gang is framed for the murder of another gang's leader, and then they have to kind of escape New York City to get back to Coney Island, where they are from. And the movie is just their, I don't want to say adventure, their terror-ridden trek back to Coney Island, if you will. I enjoyed it. If I wasn't wowed by it, I can see why it's become a cult classic, but there are some silly aspects to it that made me laugh, which is not the reaction I think they were going for. Enjoyable, if not overwhelmingly so. Countdown is the demonic killer app movie that no one was asking for. Bunch of jump scares, a lot of bad acting, then it was over. Demonic app. Welcome to Marwin is proof that Robert Zemeckis has not made a good movie since Castaway. I had a lot of problems with this film, mostly that the movie is more interested in the fantasy world it's depicting rather than the real world that it should have been depicting. Man, there are some bad choices in this thing. Gaslight is a 1944 film, which is the film version of the basis of the term gaslighting. It's based on a stage play. The story of a husband who is driving his wife mad by basically lying to her face about everything. A solid little thriller for 1944. Tenet is Christopher Nolan not being able to help himself. I'm just saying that if you're still explaining concepts to people well into the third act, you've probably failed to tell your story at that point. This movie is really strange because it shifts between two types of scenes. Either people in a room with a ton of exposition, or enormous set pieces. Enormous action set pieces. In that way, it's a lot like Interstellar, where it was just kind of a two-mode movie. The effects are great. The movie looks fantastic. I really like the two lead actors in John David Washington and Robert Pattinson. But Nolan just, at times, is too cerebral for most audiences, and that leads him to have to over-explain his concepts. Tenet's a puzzle box where all the pieces are laid out for you, and the result is not all that interesting. I'm glad I didn't risk my life going to a movie theater to go see it. I thought they did a nice job with Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, given that it's based on a book that's just Scary stories to tell in the dark. It's right in the title. They did a nice job with the connective tissue of this film, telling a story about a group of kids who are fighting an evil book of scary stories. It's an inventive way to go about this without going full episodic with it. But I enjoyed it. I liked how it was set in the past. It's one of those things where if you're not going to make a movie about cell phones, you might as well put it in a time period that doesn't have cell phones, so they can't really solve all their problems quickly. We see this more and more as cell phones become more and more prevalent. But I thought they did a really nice job. There's some solid nightmare fuel in this movie. There's some scary imagery. It's kind of a hard PG-13. But all in all, I enjoyed the flick. It's written by Patrick Melton and Marcus Dustan based on a story by Guillermo del Toro. So there's some good pedigree there. Who knew that Melton and Dustan would come to the prominence they would from Project Greenlight? But they did a nice job here. I really enjoyed this flick. Tom Clancy's Without Remorse is a movie that Paramount cut their losses and dumped on Amazon Prime after the pandemic started. It's not very good. It doesn't make a lot of sense. The plot is basically incomprehensible. The set pieces are simultaneously too PG-13 to be an R and too R to be a PG-13. It's a weird kind of mix where they're trying to go for the John Wick, the Raid style type of action, but they also wanted to make a PG-13 movie because the one F-bomb that's in the movie is censored. They were trying to get that PG-13 rating, but didn't get it. It's rated R, but it's not R enough to be compelling in any way as a action film. It's a weird middle ground this thing sits in. Performance from Michael B. Jordan is fine, but for the most part, this is a forgettable paint-by-numbers action movie that is trying to check all the boxes without checking any of them. Happy Death Day to You, I had a lot of fun with. I really enjoyed the original film. This one kind of doubles down on the sci-fi elements of the first film and more the comedic aspects. This movie's not overly scary. The concept of the first movie is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. But I enjoyed the film. It is a lesser sequel, but I found it entertaining, if marginally. And Roma is the final 2018 nominee for Best Picture that I have to see. I'm way behind on these Academy pictures. Directed by Alfonso Cuarón, and he kind of made a French New Wave film in Spanish. Story of some servants who are among a city in crisis, working for a family in crisis. And they become in crisis. Everyone's in crisis in this movie. But really well shot, beautiful film. Well acted. It's an Alfonso Cuarón film. You know what you're getting with this guy. And given the Academy's love of Cuarón and his past works, really, Academy? Green Book? This thing? What the fuck?